Dear friends, in the past several segments, we discussed with you multidimensional geopolitics and forbidden history of Russia. I know you have learned a lot, and what you have to understand is what we did. We laid out the foundation for understanding the true, deep meaning of this webinar. Going forward in the following segments, as well as in the written part that follows our spoken part, we will be discussing secrets and mysteries so deep that only the most advanced people, the smartest people, can understand, can glean these secrets. If you're here today, then you're meant to be here. You are meant to hear these messages. You are meant to understand them. And this is why I'm so privileged. I'm so happy to share all this with you. This is the first time any of this is being shared with public. I have known these mysteries, which are mystical and esoteric in nature, for quite a few years. It would be about 16, 17 years that I understood all this. And I want to tell you a couple of secrets of mine. Secret number one, which is not really that much of a secret, is that, in fact, I intended to write the book called The Putin Enigma and release it around this time or maybe next year. But instead, because the book takes about 1 year to write and publish from start to finish, and that's not counting dealing with publishers, that could take even longer, I decided that I did not have that kind of time, because I would have to take that time away from communicating and connecting with you, my dear readers and friends and listeners. And I didn't want to do that. So I decided to release all that in the form of the webinar. And this is cutting edge, pioneering information that you have not heard anywhere before. You might have heard bits and pieces from me, a little hint here and there, and you might have seen some copycats on the web, maybe some other websites, maybe some other blogs, or on YouTube. And the reason I have copycats, and that's my other secret that I never shared with anybody, in fact, except my closest friend. And this secret is started in the year 2000, when I first laid my eyes on Putin, when he first became the president of Russia. Right after, I also noticed Medvedev, who usually was very close to Putin since the beginning of 2000s. In fact, they knew each other, as I mentioned previously, much earlier. They actually worked together in St. Petersburg throughout the 90s. So they knew each other for quite a few years, possibly 5, 6, up to 8 years prior to the year 2000. Putin and Medvedev immediately struck me as very important, and something very special was starting there in Russia. I knew that right away. And so I started looking into that, and it took me only just a few seconds to realize connections between Medvedev and Nicholas II, or Nikolai II, the last emperor of Russia, as well as their respective wives, and Putin and Rasputin. But that was on the surface. And so what happened, in the beginning of 2000s, I had an extensive feng shui practice, and I also had a feng shui website. It was a dedicated website. On this website, as well as in classes that I sometimes conducted with my feng shui clients, I shared with them my discoveries. On the website, I had a specific section dedicated to this whole mystery of Putin, Rasputin, as well as Medvedev and Nicholas. And throughout this segment and next segments, you will see exactly what I'm talking about. I will be showing you pictures. You will be seeing and experiencing these aha moments as I explain to you what I mean here. And so, apparently, some copycats, after I took down my website, they decided to take advantage of it. And I saw my pictures, my parallel pictures that you will see throughout this segment, posted elsewhere, floating around the web. All those people saying that those are their discoveries, as well as Putin, Rasputin. But know that I was the first one who pointed all that out in the very beginning of 2000s. And from there on, others took my idea, ran with it. However, they can only know that superficial thing. They can't know the entire story behind it. Only the author, only the one who thought about all this, made all these synchronicities and connections, saw them laid out through Akashic records, like laid out like a big map, like a big tapestry in front of her. That would be yours truly. Only I can tell you the whole story, and this is what you're going to hear today. So let's proceed. And the first person we are going to talk about is Medvedev, who is the Prime Minister of Russia, who was for 4 years Russian president from 2008 through 2012. That was after Putin finished his second term. Then there was Medvedev for 4 years. And now is Putin again, and Medvedev remains at his side as prime minister. Before 2008, when Putin was president, Medvedev again was prime minister. There were incidentally a lot of jokes about that in Russia. And some people are very irritated by this connection because unlike Putin, Medvedev is actually universally kind of disliked in Russia. It's not like a hate, but a dislike. And that's very interesting, and hold this thought because that will be significant going forward. So we have Medvedev, who somehow by an invisible umbilical cord is attached to Putin throughout this whole 17 years that Putin has been in power, or Medvedev was in power and Putin was second to him, supposedly as prime minister. But everybody thought that Putin was still the czar, quote unquote, of the country, while Medvedev was just filling in when Medvedev was in fact the president. And all this is super significant to remember when we proceed on our way to discovery of what Medvedev really is, where he comes from, and what he's doing. How come he keeps his position and Putin won't fire him despite so many people calling for it? Why they're attached by that tremendous, unbelievable, invisible umbilical cord. They're basically twins from another mother in some ways. And that's one of the mysteries you will discover today, why that is. In reality, Medvedev is as much of an enigma as Putin. And his role, I told you that before and I'm repeating this, is rather important, and it is a fixed point in this space-time continuum that we're living in. This is extremely, extremely important to understand and remember, and I will tell you why. Okay, now imagine the time-space continuum as a spiral. It's a vertical spiral, and every round, next round, following round of the spiral is just like the previous one, but higher. It is like going up, up, again, one round up, another one round up, etc., etc. And this is your time-space continuum when you look at it multidimensionally. It is seemingly history, you know how they say history repeats itself, but it repeats itself on a very new level. And here we see, in a way, history replaying itself on this new level with a very new quality to it. So I'm going to drop this bomb on you right away. I know I dropped a lot of bombs before, but nothing like the bombs I'll be dropping in the following segments. And the first bomb is this. We will compare Emperor Nicholas II and his wife, Empress Alexandra, the last Tsar and Tsaritsa of Russia, to Dmitry Medvedev and his wife. Do you know why? I'm going to be showing you these pictures throughout this whole narrative, and pay a lot of attention to these pictures because you will see uncanny resemblance between Nicholas and Dmitry Medvedev. But also you will see very similar resemblance, although not as striking perhaps, between Empress Alexandra and Medvedev's wife. And here is why. Because Medvedev, ready for this, is reincarnated Nicholas II. Not only that, but Empress Alexandra, with certain stipulations, is Medvedev's wife. In fact, that's a reincarnation. why there is a reincarnation. Very simple. I will explain all this to you right away, because let's just use contemporary word. Nicholas screwed up back in 1900s. From 1914 through 1917, he royally screwed up, no pun intended, and he had to come back with the new understanding, with the new knowledge, with the new wisdom to work out that karma and to set things straight. Because we just talked in previous segments that something went wrong in the 20th century. It didn't have to be that bloody. It didn't have to be that terrible, that confusing for all. But what really happened? How did that get confusing? The reason it got confusing, I said that many times before, was that too much power was ceded by Russia, the Great Balancer, to the West. And the world became very imbalanced. So imbalanced, in fact, that we had two crazy, devastating world wars. We had Cold War. We had unbelievable juxtaposition, standoff between great powers. And that always existed, except we now have nuclear weapons, we now have hybrid wars, we have ability to destroy and disrupt any country's functioning to such a degree that it's going to be very devastating without being so on the surface. We have HARP, we have weather modification, we have laser weapons, there are so many things. We have the possibility of certain Star Wars, perhaps even, if they wanted to go that way. There are many, many things that could be done, and so much power that should have never happened was ceded to the West that it has to be corrected. And some of those people who were there in the beginning of the 20th century, some of those souls who screwed up, maybe unwittingly, because they did not realize how bad it could get, they had to come back and work on correcting it. I'm going to talk about Putin later, and you will understand why I started with Medvedev. Because Medvedev, believe it or not, is a lot more on the surface. He is so much easier to understand. I'm dropping these bombs on you. He's reincarnated. Oh, nothing. He's just reincarnated Emperor Nicholas II. Oh, and his wife is Alexandra. Oh, who cares, right? Well, believe me, this is very, very small compared to what Putin is here to do and what Putin really is. So I'm showing you these pictures right now, and on pictures you are looking, this is Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra, and here's Dmitry Medvedev, and here's his wife. Okay, look at, they resemble each other, and look at generally how they keep each other now, how they hold themselves. Now, Nicholas II, or Nikolai, as we call him in Russian, was famous for several things. Number one was that he was very slight of stature. He was a small man. He was a short man, very compact, in fact. And he also was famous for his very straight posture. I'm showing all this to you on pictures right now. And look at Dmitry Medvedev right now. Somehow nobody seemed to notice. Look at this resemblance. Look at this crazy resemblance. Slight man, short of stature, very unusual. In fact, Russians are not short as a rule. Russian men are pretty tall, and Russian women too are pretty tall. We are talking 5'6" here. Usually women in Russia are about between 5'6" and maybe 5'8", 5'10". That's in feet and inches. And in centimeters, we're talking about something like 165 centimeters. So women would be that height, usually between 165 centimeters and about 170, 175. That would be normal for women. That's kind of on the low end for women. And Medvedev is only about 165, 166 maybe, possibly up to 168. I think he's a little bit shorter than Putin, who is also on the short end. He's about 5'7", so that would be about 168 centimeters, up to 170, I believe. So we have this short man, very compact, The figure is exactly like Nicholas's, right? Look at his face. Exactly like Nicholas. Look at the structure of the face. Look at his nose. Look at his forehead. Look at everything. Exactly like Nicholas, right? So close, in fact. Now, very important. That's one thing, but look at his posture. Look at the posture of Medvedev. Now compare it to Nicholas. Very close resemblance, right? Now, these are the pictures. We will be alternating. Pictures of Dmitry Medvedev and Nicholas II. Look at these pictures. This is Dmitry Medvedev with the monarch of Spain, King of Spain. And Medvedev looks so much at home in the tux next to the King and Queen of Spain. He belongs there, right? Because he does. He knows that he does. He was there before. He was one of the great monarchs of Europe and of the world back in those days. Very, very close. Look at him with other heads of state. And look at that straight posture again. Look at that unusually straight posture. You know, monarchs and royals, they are taught how to stand straight. They are taught that kind of posture. You know, the commoners, commoners don't get that kind of upbringing. And for him, for Medvedev, who was born in a very simple family in St. Petersburg, for him, that could not be learned from his parents or from his school. He went to a normal, modest Soviet school back in St. Petersburg. So did Putin, incidentally. They both are from St. Petersburg, which was Leningrad during the Soviet Union. And that's also important that Medvedev is actually born and lived most of his life until he moved to Moscow in St. Petersburg. That's where Nicholas was born. That's where he lived all his life, right? As Emperor of Russia. And again, we're back to this posture. That's actually amazing. Look at that posture. Look how straight he stands. He stands out. He's next to this guard, Kremlin guard. And those guys are actually taught for years to walk super straight, to have this amazing posture. And they don't have posture like Medvedev's. And Nicholas was famous for that kind of straight, super straight military posture. Another thing that is famous about Nicholas is that he was not ready to take the throne. His father suddenly dies. Suddenly, very suddenly. And he is basically called on to take over the crown when he was not ready. And he was not ready his entire life until his death. That's how he was too soft. He was a very nice family man. He loved his children and his wife. So does Dmitry Medvedev. Look, he is married very happily to one woman all his life. Now, Nicholas had one son, several daughters, several princesses, and one son, the heir to the throne. Dmitry Medvedev has one son. Well, these are very circumstantial as far as parallels go, but in conjunction with everything else I'm telling you, how did Medvedev, with that kind of appearance, with that like very unassuming, very modest kind of personality, how did he get to the top and stays there despite all odds, despite so many calls to dismiss him to Putin, and Putin won't do it? Because Medvedev is supposed to be there. He's a fixed point in this space-time continuum. Is the spiral. He jumped from one ring of the spiral to the following one. He is supposed to correct his mistakes. Only then his karma will be worked out. This agreement between Putin and Medvedev, that's agreement between souls that actually happens in other dimensions. That's beyond this dimension, beyond our life, even beyond our time-space continuum. This is done in higher dimensions, and Medvedev brings in certain knowledge, certain deep, that profound soul knowledge of Russia, of governing, of how to be at the top, and he's necessary because of that. Yes, there are many problems, and when he works out his karma, hey, maybe he'll do that in the next couple of years, and maybe then he will be dismissed. Maybe then he can go and do something else. Once he works out his karma, maybe his karma will never be worked out and he will continue toiling to try to correct his past life mistakes throughout his entire life. Maybe his lessons are that pervasive. That I'm not going to tell you right now, although I have a suspicion that he will be there for another, say, 10 or more years, thereabouts. I think that about 10 years I'll give him, either as PM or as something similar there at the government. And we also need to talk about his name, and that's forbidden linguistics for you. That's also a synchronicity. It's a very talking name, Medvedev. You know, Medved means bear. What is the symbol of Russia? It's the bear, right? So Medvedev, the son of bear, basically. The son of bear, and yeah, what is he? He's the son of Russia, son of bear. It's a talking name. It's a hint. It's yet another multidimensional hint at who we are dealing with. This is the whole story in a gist. It's a very short version. But when you actually look at this and just unravel all this, it's truly amazing. Now, take Medvedev's wife. Remember Putin's ex-wife who hated to be in the spotlight, so much so that she actually wanted a divorce. She wanted private life. She wanted to stay away from all that. That was too much for her. She didn't want her husband to be away and working 24/7. And she bowed out. And it was a super amicable divorce. They're still friends. And she married another person. That's Putin's wife. And now look at Medvedev's wife. And Medvedev's wife looks very nice in the spotlight. She likes to dress up. Very telling also, right? Alexandra, she was not like a super fashionista, Alexandra, but she liked to dress up, of course, as anybody in her position would. And she had to dress up. And Medvedev's wife feels very comfortable in the spotlight. That's why he always brings her everywhere. Putin's wife, Lyudmila, never wanted to be in the spotlight. That's why it's very interesting that you can see on pictures Putin, Medvedev, and Medvedev's wife together in a church or in some other circumstances, and you see them, the three of them, like this. Not so much anymore, but also during major events, say church events, you can see the three of them together still to this day. And that tells us something again. Medvedev's wife is in fact as reincarnated Empress Alexandra, with some stipulations because it's not as close, not as full of a soul, but this is not the part of this webinar, so I'm not going to explain to you about how souls can divide themselves, for example. But as former Alexandra in previous life, she's very comfortable being amongst people, being photographed, being in the limelight. She's very comfortable with that. And also look at her clothes. They're stylish, but they're somewhat old-fashioned. They're not like super fashionable. They are a little bit on this traditional side. So this is very interesting. She likes this role. She carries this role of the First Lady very well. Of course, because she was First Lady before. She has no trouble with that. That's a natural for her. And again, I'm reminding you that Medvedev and his wife come from very simple working families in St. Petersburg. They don't come from anywhere, from any sort of amazing, well-to-do families. They were brought up in the Soviet Union as far as income goes and as far as possibilities of what they can do, how they can educate their children. Very average possibilities. Now, I also wanted to mention is that Medvedev, being prime minister, is also the chairman of the United Russia Party. This is the ruling party that has a pretty large majority, over 60%, I believe. They have constitutional majority in the Duma. And Medvedev became the chairman of the United Russia Party after he stopped being president in 2012. Putin gets elected, so he replaces Medvedev. Yeah, and it seems like they're switched chairs, basically. And then Medvedev becomes the chairman of the United Russia Party, which was in fact agreed upon. But I want to draw your attention to the title, United Russia. What is Medvedev here to do? After he made so many boo-boos with his previous lifetime as Nicholas, he is here to, what? Reunite Russia, hence United Russia. And the symbol, incidentally, of this party is the bear. Also a karmically fixed point, because Medvedev is here to help reunite Russia. Well, this is exactly why, no matter how much pressure he receives, Putin doesn't fire Medvedev. Even if Medvedev sometimes does not live up to expectations. But see, Medvedev is not supposed to live up to expectations because he's still reincarnated Nicholas. And remember what we said, Nicholas was not comfortable with his role as Tsar. He really was not ready for the throne. But he still brings with him that energy and that understanding from other dimensions, and also karmic situation that piles up on top of everything else. And this is why he is where he is. This is a soul contract, prior agreement between souls to work together. And I'm not just talking Putin and Medvedev, I'm talking mega souls here. You will hear later me talk about oversouls. And oversouls include things that we usually perceive as inorganic objects or objects that are not alive, perhaps. But in fact, they are. So huge oversoul is our Mother Earth, for example. Another huge oversoul is Mother Russia. And did you ever think why they call Russia Mother Russia? For that reason, Russia is that great balancer. From Russia, everything else came. This civilization started there in Arctic Rus, that is sometimes referred to as Hyperborea or Hyperborea, which of course is a later name. We prefer to call it, those Russian researchers who are in the know, we prefer to call it the Arctic Rus. That Aryan civilization seeded to Earth, that's the latest civilization. I talked more about it in previous webinars 3 and 4, and I'm not going to go back to that. I promise we will do separate webinars on that. Maybe one day I will get to talking about true forbidden history, millennia ago, eons ago, what really happened here. But this is a contract between major souls, between oversouls, and say the soul of Russia, the oversoul of Russia, comes into play. This is why Medvedev gets so much help. This is why Medvedev remains in his position, regardless of how much opposition there is to him being prime minister. And he will continue being there, as I said, to fix everything he has done wrong, to fix his karma. Now, we will be proceeding to Putin very soon. For that, I have the next 2 segments. They're dedicated to Putin and everything about him, as well as written report, which will be in the end. All this is super important. I'll be dropping a ton of bombs on you, and these multidimensional bombs are, no pun intended, to die for. But I just need to mention a couple of things in this segment about Putin, and then we will proceed to discussing Putin as is. So there are many guesses as to what Putin really is or was, how he reincarnated. He looks like this Tsar or this emperor. Somebody recently wrote to me that he is reincarnated Julius Caesar. And yeah, maybe there is a little bit of that energy in him. Why not? The soul that was once Caesar could contribute to Putin's oversoul, and I'm revealing too much for you already. Oversoul is what we will be discussing in the next segment, and what that truly means. See, Putin was himself, that main oversoul that Putin is, was never a Tsar or emperor here on Earth. That is a cosmic soul, and Putin is so much more than that. it's almost laughable to think of him as a czar or emperor somewhere in 3D on Earth. And what Putin really is will be revealed in the following segments, I promise you. But right now, I want to emphasize one more detail here. So this is about the fact that the dark state, whether it's NWO, Bilderberg, globalists, deep state, you name it, they missed both Putin and Medvedev. When Putin and Medvedev first came in, what happened was that Putin, they both, in fact, I should say, behaved in such a way as to lull into complacency those forces in the West that wanted to weaken and destroy Russia, the great balancer. Putin actually behaved brilliantly. He would be on the good side of George Bush. Say after 9/11, he was the first one who sent condolences and sympathies to George Bush regarding what happened with Twin Towers. And we now know that that was major false flag that changed what we know about the US, how US operates, and changing everything. And in fact, that was this harbinger of period 8 that we are living in. The proliferation of the military, attacks against other countries, etc., etc. False flags, as a matter of fact, terrorist acts and all that. But at the time that Putin came in, and I will discuss all this in great detail in the following episodes, him and Medvedev, they behaved in such a way that they allowed all that dark state, deep state, globalists, NWO, to miss them. They only understood later and tried to correct their mistake by attempting to bribe and subvert and compromise Putin and Medvedev. But what transpired out of their efforts? Remember, 2008, it was the opening of the Beijing Olympics. And on that very day, when the opening of the Olympics was happening, various heads of state were there. Putin was in Beijing during the opening ceremony. Of course, the Chinese president was there, and Bush was there as the president of the US, as well as some heads of European states. And on that very day, as that opening ceremony was taking place in Beijing, what was happening? Georgia attacked South Ossetia. I wrote about it previously in 2014 and about parallels between 2008 Beijing Olympics and 2014 Sochi Olympics, during which what happened? Kiev Maidan and the coup in Kiev. Parallels are absolutely uncanny, and it was obvious that the same playbook was being used again and again. So Saakashvili of Georgia attacks South Ossetia. Putin is sitting in the stadium watching the opening ceremony of the Olympics and greeting Russian team that is passing by. And at that very moment, who was at the helm? Who was the new president of Russia? Very young president. And remember, he was the youngest. Medvedev was the youngest president, probably the youngest in the world president at the time. He was about 42 years of age when he became president, possibly up to 44, but he was very young. He was very new at that time to have such a young president anywhere. And so Medvedev is there, and Medvedev is forced to make a decision. South Ossetia is attacked. South Ossetia is under Russian protection, and as Georgians attack South Ossetia, they kill 8 Russian peacekeepers, Russian troops that were there on the border, and they bomb them and they kill 8 people. This becomes known, and Medvedev has to make a crucial decision of his entire life in this incarnation as Medvedev. He has to authorize Russian troops to go and teach a lesson to Georgians. Not only that, he has to authorize them crossing the border from South Ossetia, which was a breakaway, but not a fully breakaway, kind of protected territory, into Georgia. And he did it. And why is that important? Why is that like a crucial decision of his entire life. And why is that so scary for Medvedev? Why do you think? Because as Nicholas II, when he was Nicholas II, he once authorized Russia to get into World War I. And what was the result of that terrible decision? The result was that there was a revolution, two revolutions in 1917 that overthrew him, that cost him his life ultimately and the life of his entire family, and cost him the entire country, and plunged the country into a bloody, devastating civil war and changed everything in the 20th century. So Medvedev, with that karmic knowledge, that karmic fear of making another mistake again, he has to make this kind of decision when Putin is away, and he in fact is president. And he once revealed in one of the interviews, he actually sort of said a little more than he intended to when he said that when he made that decision, that was his responsibility. And it was a very difficult thing for him because he understood that he would be fully responsible for any consequences. Now, let's recall it was 2008. And Russia was nowhere near as strong as Russia is today. Russia could still be trampled on by the West if they really wanted to. And what they were testing, that poking of Russia, killing peacekeepers and poking of Russia through Saakashvili, teasing Russia, was the test. How will Russia respond? And how will new president respond that just took office several months ago in March of that year? Knowing him as a softie, they thought that he would just watch it, that he would do nothing. Perhaps there was even a certain multidimensional knowledge there of who he really was. But Medvedev acted. He actually acted out of character because he is very far from being a military-inclined man. Very far. He, in fact, is a humanitarian by nature. So he acted this way and he saved the day. It was a 4-day war. Of course, later Putin engaged and proper advice came in, and what Russians did, they destroyed the port of Poti, which was on the Georgian side. So they crossed into Georgia, generating this huge storm of indignation from the West and sanctions and condemnations and all that. But Russians used this opportunity to destroy the Poti port. I wrote about it in 2014. Poti was a port which was used by the US to accumulate hardware, create bases, and settle some troops there in order to attack Iran from Georgia. In fact, the Russian military they destroyed all that hardware, and actually they took some of that hardware as their trophies as well, which US tried to get back after that, because apparently there were some secrets in some of that hardware that Russians took over from the US. And after that, as we know, attack on Iran, of which everybody was talking about in 2008, never happened, because the best possible position for the attack was actually destroyed. And then they were, in fact, outed. And so they never tried again. Well, they tried from the sea, but that's impossible because Iran is better equipped from that side than from the Georgian side. And if you look at the map, you will see how close that is. So Georgia, in fact, could have been used as a launching pad for the attack on Iran. This is a very cloak and dagger. This is very deep secret. And you will not hear anybody talk about this except me. This is basically exclusive information. If anybody else is talking about it, that's a copycat because they read it in my 2014 articles. So what Medvedev revealed was that he was made out of a lot sterner stuff. And I bet he worked out a lot of his karma by that one decision. What was also interesting about that, it was a 4-day war. After 4 days, having destroyed what they needed to destroy, capturing some American hardware, proving the point, they did not go all the way to Tbilisi, and Russian army withdrew back into South Ossetian territory within the boundaries of South Ossetia, after which South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which is another breakaway small territory of Georgia, declared independence from Georgia officially, which they had not done before. They became territories that are only recognized by several states. Russia recognized them both, and as a result, they are protectorates of Russia, where Russian troops are stationed, where there are Russian bases, and they take the cue basically from the Kremlin about many, many things. So not everything, because they have their own governors, but about many, many things. And they dream about joining Russia as subjects of the Russian Federation. However, Russians don't want to start any more trouble than there already is in that regard. And there you have it. They tried to see how corruptible Medvedev is, and he proved that he is not. And a lot of people talk about Medvedev as a continuation of the Gorbachev-Yeltsin line, whom they call traitors. And I mentioned that before, and I will mention again, I do not consider Gorbachev and Yeltsin conscious traitors. Yes, they were somewhat corruptible, I should say, but they honestly thought that they were leading the country to something better. And later, Gorbachev to a lesser degree, Yeltsin to a lot more of a degree, realized that they made a mistake and tried to, at least Yeltsin tried to correct it by naming Putin as the new president. And Medvedev actually proved that he learned from previous mistakes of his peers and also of his own in previous lifetime. And he did not make a mistake. He did not get corrupted. And now they tried to corrupt him and bribe him when he was in the West. There is this infamous photo of Medvedev with Steve Jobs from Apple when Medvedev gets the newest first edition cell phone that Apple just released. At the time, it was the newest smartphone, and he's holding it with this, looking at it with glee. And yes, Medvedev is considered very Western-oriented for a Russian politician. He is one of those Western-oriented politicians, and this is why he was always sent to the West to talk to all kinds of monarchs and heads of state, because he has an in. And what I mentioned before to you, as reincarnated Nicholas, he definitely has an in with all kinds of monarchs of Europe, heads of state of Europe, because that was his past. He's good at that. He just knows how to talk to them. And so his seeming fascination with everything Western is because he's just used to that. That's his previous lifetimes. But when it comes to trying to corrupt him somehow, then they hit a wall. They cannot go any further. And this happened again and again. Then there was this attempt, many attempts in fact, they're very famous attempts to try and put a rift between Putin and Medvedev. They were called a tandem for years. So Putin and Medvedev formed a tandem. And that tandem, that's what they ran on. That was their ticket, like two people, a tandem running together, running Russia together. It was working up until 2012, in which they did away with that. And the reason for that was that when Medvedev was in power as president, the West did absolutely everything, and pro-Western NGOs and MSM and various talking heads in Russia, and there were plenty of those. There are fewer now. There are plenty of those in 2008 through 2012. They did everything to try to put a rift between Putin and Medvedev and break up that tandem. And again, they did not succeed. So Medvedev proved to be very staunch, very loyal, knowing exactly where he stands, even if he seems a softy. But once you get to a specific certain boundary, then you hit a wall. You cannot proceed any further with Medvedev. He seems like very pliable, very amicable, very soft on so many levels, and suddenly they hit a wall. And that was the end of it. Now they basically left them alone. They're trying to corrupt or bribe other Russian officials. And it happened to Lavrov, for example, Russian foreign minister, when suddenly it emerged that Lavrov was bringing his daughter back from the US. And what started in the Russian pro-Western press, as well as in certain places in the West, was that, he keeps his daughter in the West, he's corrupted, his daughter is actually an American. And the reason she was in the West was because she was born in the US when Lavrov was ambassador. Then she went to American school, then she went to American college. This is why she was in the US. But he had to interrupt all that, interrupt her studies, interrupt her life, and bring her back to Russia because it became too dangerous. Keeping children in the West, where they might have gone to school or perhaps their parents worked there, and so children continued education there. All Russian politicians, Russian officials had to whisk their children from the West, the majority of them anyway, and bring them back home, because starting in 2008, but especially in 2014, it became very dangerous because children could have been kidnapped, they could have been held hostage, they could have been corrupted, they could have been turned against their country and made spy. All kinds of things could have happened. And there was a mass exodus, in fact, of Russian officials' children from the West who were still there. And this is why Lavrov brought his daughter back. So that's the story of how they tried to corrupt Russian officials and how they were hitting the wall every time. They actually stopped doing that more or less, but there were attempts upon attempts. And Medvedev was the first one on whom they tried all this. Of course, they tried the same on Putin, but Putin just used, incidentally, just like Lenin, he used what was necessary to use from the West. Like, for example, he was agreeing to a certain point for several years until he strengthened his position and his vertical of power, as it's called in Russia, the vertical of power, the entire tree of power. Until it was strengthened, he was agreeing with everything, he was just smiling until he was strong enough to actually strike it out and do things that he needed to do on his own. And this is the story of Medvedev. And this is the story of why Putin and Medvedev have been so close for so many years. I hope you enjoyed it. And in the next segment, we will be proceeding to the entire point of this webinar. We are going to be talking about Putin. Don't go away. So much more is coming your way.